As you can see, we're joined by three people, and maybe you can start with you introducing yourselves briefly. Alan, I know you're into digital forensics, cybercrime investigation, but I'm gonna hold off and let you introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Cheboy. I'm part of the Build Up team. I lead the digital technology and data analysis within the Build Up organization. And that basically means I'm part of the team that tries to use data to understand how the digital ecosystem influences conflict situations, especially. In the past, as you've mentioned, I've worked as a cybercrime investigator, trying to figure out how, hackers, for example, are using the digital space to influence decisions in one way or another. I've also been part of a team that conducted investigations into cases of manipulation through digital spaces, so cases such as misinformation, disinformation, information operations, or foreign influence for that context, but also trying to understand how extremist groups are also using digital spaces to perpetrate conflict in one way or another. Thank you so much, and I'm glad to be on this panel.
Thank you, Alan. I really look forward to hearing more about the work that you do later. But before I turn over the mic to Deborah, I'd like to say that we're very happy to have her here with us. I know that Pancho has been inviting Deborah to travel to the Philippines for the past 28 years, and she's finally here. Deb, thank you so much for making the trip and believing in the relevance of the discussions we'll be having over the next 3 days. Please.
Is that on? There we are. Hello, everyone. I am so humbled to be here, and it's hard to follow your expertise, really. My area of interest and what I come from is civil society. And certainly for the past few years, I've been working on shifting power to local and national civil societies. I co-convene something called the Ringo Project, which is about reimagining INGOs, but it's actually more about creating an ecosystem for civil society where local actors are in the driver's seat, where they have the resources and the power to build their own civil societies. And I came at this having worked on, I've spent almost 28 years since Pancho and I met in civil society across humanitarian development, human rights, and environment spaces. I've worked across a number of them. I haven't worked in the peace building sector. So this is quite new and exciting for me. And I was most recently working prior to the Ringo Project on civic space, the enabling environment for civil society, running a donor collaborative. So working in the donor space, which was an eye-opener, shall we say, and I hope we get into the discussion about how we need to shift power away from donors to local communities, how local communities can own their data, own their knowledge, own their development. And that's what I do all of the time. And I write on it. Written a book about it. And that's me.
Thank you, Deb, and congratulations on the recent publication of your book, which asks deeply critical but crucial questions of INGOs. And I hope we can bring in the same important questions in our discussion later. So last but not the least, Pancho, who has worn very many hats, a professor, chair of the Ceasefire Committee of the Government and the Communist Party of the Philippines, a staunch activist of the peasant movement and agrarian reform, among many others. But to me personally and to many of us from CCAA, he is really mostly our teacher and our mentor. That's why it's really exciting and daunting at the same time to be moderating this panel. But please, Pancho.
Hello, good morning. My name is Francisco Pancho Lara. Okay, a lot of you probably know me when I was with International Alert, country manager of International Alert from its founding here in the Philippines in 2011 up to 2017. And then I returned to the university and then was teaching and just really recently retired from the University of the Philippines. I also had some experience working on the negotiations behind the agreement, both for the war conflict and also of the communist insurgency. So I suppose that's it. So I've worn so many hats. I've been with government for years. I was with the Department for Trade and Reform also. And then I worked in the private sector. I was the chair of a local bank, development bank. And then finally with the INGO. For years, I was also the country manager of the British Volunteers in the Philippines. And pardon me if I speak so slowly. I got Bell's palsy a couple of months ago, and I'm still slurring, so I'll try to speak as fast as I can. Oh, right now I'm the executive director of CCAA.
See so many hats. Okay, so thank you for introducing yourselves, and it's really exciting. We have a diverse set of expertise over here. So for the rest of the session, let's talk about data, conflict, and power and the relationship between the three. But that sounds to me like something very big and abstract. So maybe we should start off with a very basic and fundamental question of how do you use data in your work? Tell us about the work that you do. Okay. Let's go with maybe the same order. Alan can go first.
So maybe I can start. I use data in more or less everything that I do at the moment, and largely because when you look at conflict nowadays, there is a lot that happens on digital spaces that you need to understand, both digital spaces and offline, right? So a lot of the work that I do is to look at how digital spaces are actually being used at this modern age to try and influence what happens during conflict. As an example, right now, if you look at the situation in Gaza, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, and some of the forgotten wars such as the one in Sudan, in other countries in Africa, in the DRC, you realize that technology is playing a very huge role. And not only technology, specifically social media platforms. So the information that is being shared on social media platforms is becoming very, very critical in how the war shapes up in these different countries. So how I approach this is, how do you then use the information on these platforms, such as social media platforms, but largely also how do you collect enough data to make sense of what is influencing the conflict in one way or another. So that's how I integrate data analysis into my work. So at Build Up, for example, one of the things that we do is collecting social media information or social media data based on indicators of how the conflict is progressing. Then that helps us to actually try and understand how do we then empower local communities, for example, journalists on the ground, for example, local civil society on the ground with information that is critical for them to be able to do initiatives in peace building or in one way or another respond to the conflict situation. So that's how I think how powerful data is at the moment in this day and age. And Helena just mentioned about the use of AI. That is one of the key things that we are witnessing, where artificial intelligence is now being used even during conflict to either increase the level of conflict that is happening, or in one way or another to shape the opinions of the environment online, right? So that is one of the key things that also I focus on, trying to figure out, number one, how do you use AI for positive? So building something that we call machine learning classifiers for us to understand how language online can be used to try and influence conversations, but also try to see how bad actors or people who are within the conflict situations are using AI in order to influence the conflict in itself. So yeah, that's, I think, probably as briefly as I can say how I integrate data in my work.
We started off with our work on conflict monitoring. A lot of people here probably know us for our work in monitoring violent conflict. Nikki spoke about a database of about 50,000 discrete incidents of violent conflict that we've gathered from 2011 to 2013, not 2023 rather, no? And the reasons behind that are dual actually. In the beginning, we went into monitoring conflict because we needed to identify causes. And that was really driven by our local partners. It was a demand coming from the ground. When you look at data then, data was called crime data, okay? There was no such thing as conflict data. And most of crime data was fatalities, injuries, etc. It was the magnitude of conflict, not the causes of conflict. In fact, years later, when we worked with the Philippine National Police, that was the first time they started looking at what was identity conflict, what was resource-based conflict, which the people knew. No? People will tell you this conflict is because of land. It has nothing to do with religion. It's two families. Also, when two MILF commanders square off, and it's not really between ideology. It's really because one represented a clan that had interests against another clan. So it was a process. That was the first. Ironically, the second demand came from the World Bank. Full disclosure. We were funded by the World Bank to do this because the World Bank had failed to develop its own conflict monitoring system, not for lack of trying. They had spent millions of dollars working on a conflict monitoring system, and later on discovered that much of that money went to their consultants. At the end of a process of developing it, they had 500 discrete incidents of violent conflict over a period of 3 years. When we did our work in the beginning, we had immediately 5,000 discrete incidents of conflict in the first year when we started gathering data. And the reason behind that was because we pushed ourselves to go beyond the traditional sources of data. Why? Because it was important to have our partners on the ground. If you remember, guys, at that time, much of the demand was development that wasn't peace building. And then you had the World Bank, whose demand was macro data to be able to make the case for the peace negotiations. So the World Bank wanted to prove that they were in the right direction because this particular war was leading to so much conflict. And then they funded it, and they funded us for almost 10 years. According to the World Bank, one of the groups that they funded, an NGO that got funding from them over a long period of time, a decade, and for a quite substantial amount of money. So you had two demands, and you had to fulfill. You had to address their demands, right? So from the very beginning, how do you handle this? How do you balance this between the needs of marginalized, vulnerable citizens and the needs of the World Bank to be able to make the case? And that is when the conflict monitoring system was developed, really locally, and it went against the grain of other conflict. At the very start, we said that we would not be relying on media data. You look, I'm not going to mention now, you look at the major global databases, and 95% of them are based on newspaper reports. And we knew from the beginning that if you relied on media reports, they were not really the ones gathering data, they were gathering data that had been screened, right? Parsed by someone else. And journalists want to talk about data that is sensational, right? So you're missing out. So one thing that was really missing was you don't see so much data on gender, domestic violence, because they don't take the news. Okay? They will in the case of, outstanding or, really incredulous cases of violence, of rape, etc. But not the. So that was the reason why, at the end of it, we knew we needed to, broaden the scope. And so we also knew that we had to respect government because government was mandated to gather data. That was the role, the Philippine National Police. So the work went into convincing the Philippine National Police that they should come out with it, and that led to the CIRAS database of the Philippine National Police. So we are happy that to some extent we had influenced the process of development even with them. And the police data is 10 to 1 For one data we got, they would have 10 from media. And almost 95% of media reports are in the police reports anyway, which meant that your journalists actually just went to police stations, right, to gather blotter reports, and that was the cost. And then we went to it. Third and most important, community-based reports. Community reports are always criticized as anecdotal. That's not important for us, frankly, that's anecdotal data. You know, give us the numbers, no? But those data, those evidence, is what gives you an understanding of one particular aspect in conflict that no one has worked on, except Nikki. Nikki's field of study was conflict strings. So she would trace an incident and how it spreads. And then she raised the question, how do you cut a string? Where, at one point, do you cut a conflict string? That data was not in any of the global reports up to now. You will not see that. And that is, what I'm saying is a process that was determined and demanded by local people who said that this is the sort of data that we needed.
Thank you.
That's quite a good bridging point to the way I use data, which is not in conflict settings necessarily, it might be, but it is all about what local people demand and want from the international system. So I use data, I'll pull up stories. On evaluations, I really try and push the international community away from saying measurement in a way that they understand and to try and define data that's relevant to local actors. What does success look like for civil society? We try and find those data points, and those are the data points I bring to bear. I also use, there is some useful data on tracking funding. Where's the funding flows going? Who's getting access to those funds? How are they being spent? I do use that data in my advocacy. We do a lot of research on what we call Voices from the Global South report, which says the experience of local civil society actors vis-a-vis their international counterparts, and try and understand those points of data and their experience around how power is given or not given, or how they take power and receive power. So it's a slightly different nuance, but it's about the strength of civil society in local settings.
There seems to be that tension between the process of collecting data and the weights that are being placed on evidence. So almost all of you made that point about local data. So let's talk more about that. Because the important questions that we need to ask would then be, how do we ensure that the data reflects the realities on the ground and really the interests of the people that we're trying to serve? So
Shall I start with the broad and then transfer
Sure.
much more expertise? So on a broad basis, the systems in which we work as civil society actors are skewed towards donor needs, right? It's what does the donor think is important? What do the political actors think is important? And what we try and do is shift the systems of accountability so that those are defined and owned by local people, that they're in the driver's seat for this is the information you collect on us, because this is the information that's relevant for our work and needs. Now, at some point, we work on negotiating that. So in terms of managing civil society, there's a point about risk. So any of you who run local organizations or national organizations or international ones will know how we assume that people at the local level are much riskier to fund, especially in a conflict setting. And we pass that risk on through 55 or more points of accountability. Through a negotiated process, actually, we did an experiment here in the Philippines, funnily enough, and with a USAID funded project, and looked at what was really risky in that circumstance. And we managed to get 55 points of accountability when we negotiated what was really needed, down to 1. So really understanding what is the real risk versus what is relative risk. So that's coming back to your data point, that's about shaping an understanding and say, actually, local people do know what they want and need, but acknowledging that there are other people who will need certain types of data, but who's in the driver's seat? And it's putting those local actors in the driver's seat. And so I do a lot of advocacy around that and working with the system of donors, national actors, local actors, finance people, your legal people, all of those people who are passing on those risks and points down the chain to say this needs to be owned and locally owned. And then just on that final point about how do we make sure that data is locally owned and that knowledge is centered locally is about shifting those systems of accountability and trust. So it's really kind of reversing the whole aid supply chain in a way, instead of being top down to be bottom up, as we heard from Helena earlier.
Yeah, so in terms of localizing data, I think that's one of the main objectives when it comes to any type of analysis, because one of the things that we've ended up realizing is when you're doing any type of analysis using data, and you use data that is acquired from an international perspective, you always miss the nuances and the local context of that particular situation. And I'll give an example. I've worked on some of the projects trying to use, to analyze both offline and online data that is collected to try and understand, the information environment, but also conflict situations. And one thing we realized is that a lot of the donors, as an example, will, just give a very general objective and say, we need to understand the conflict, for example, the situation around disinformation in the DRC. And one of the things that then happens is that when you go to that local situation, and a lot of the people have like this, we call them fly-in analysts or researchers. So they come into a country, do some very basic research, then fly out with a report, and they say this is actually the situation locally. What that then does is that it misses a lot of the local nuances when it comes to both the data collection and the analysis perspective. So what we increasingly have been doing is when we go to an environment like the DRC or in Kenya, what we normally do is we work with local partners who've lived the situation, who live the conflict, if it's a conflict situation. And they then are able to, and if you talk about, if you're researching how hate speech is contributing to conflict situation in a country, one of the things you'll actually realize is that these hate speech terms are usually very localized. They're either in local language or they are in coded or in a way that as someone who's not from that particular context will never understand that this is actually hate speech. So most of the time what we do is when you work with a local partner, that person will actually say, okay, this actually is a word that is considered hate speech in our environment. As an example, in Kenya, we did a project during elections trying to understand how hate speech was contributing to electoral violence in the country. And one of the things we actually realized is that a word such as, and I think we have some Kenyans in the room, there's a word called madoadoa. So madoadoa in Kenya just basically means, if a politician goes publicly on a podium and says, we need to remove madoadoa from this environment, that basically means we need to uproot a particular community, ethnic tribe, from this particular local environment. So that in Kenya is understood as something that is hate speech. But madoadoa is a Swahili word that generally means sports. If you go to a neighboring country in Tanzania, they also speak Swahili, that isn't considered to be hate speech. So that just shows how important local context is when it comes to both the process of data collection, data analysis itself, and also dissemination of some of the insights that you get from the analysis. So yeah, I believe that's how local perspective shapes a lot of the processes that we use, both in data analysis, but also in research generally. And that means you're actually giving that power to local people who understand the context and the situation for you to be able to get more meaningful insights on that. Yeah.
I just also would like to say that we were quite sensitive to the fact that even our partners and local people can be biased when it comes to data. No? We, from the very start, we argued that any data monitoring project should be autonomous from not only the donors but also the partners. No? Why is that the case? No? Our experience has been that during the long years trying to fight for the setting of a devolved political authority, the Bangsamoro, everyone needed the data because they needed to use it to make a case in point. I don't know if any one of you here from the Philippines still remember the 50,000 riddle. For years, the World Bank used this number. There were 50,000 deaths over a long period of time without explaining where that number came from. Huh? And so, to be able to come up with the actual sum of the magnitude of violence, you needed to talk to local people. But people were not interested always in deaths. No? We found out, for example, that in many cases now, the data that they wanted was more about displacement rather than fatalities. No? Because some people are saying displacement is worse than death. No? The net effect, so that's it. Secondly, why autonomous? Because right now people want to make the case that things have changed under the new setup. Okay, even though a lot of conflict problems remain. So we were thinking the reason why this became important was because we were thinking it's enough. No, it's about time we transferred the conflict monitoring system to a partner for them to grow. And we were wondering who could do this autonomously from so many interests.
So, we talk a lot about language in the Ringo Project and how do you deal with the dominance of English, which is the decision-making lingua franca, if you will, that people use. And there are so many multiple languages. We've been looking at, everything from Google Translate tools, which are pretty good now, but then in a human rights setting, people are very concerned about using Google. So I'm sorry, I'm taking off the phone. I want to ask a question about how do you raise trust in letting those local languages come to the fore? Because international actors don't trust them.
Yeah, definitely. So, and I think this builds on what we try to accomplish when it comes to using local language to actually solve local problems. And I'll explain how we do this. So when it comes to, there's a project that one of our donors wanted to do in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, there is a lot of religious-based violence. So how religion is primarily used in actually inciting violence in one way or another. And that's because the two predominant religions are Christian and Islam. So one of the things that really helped us is, and in Nigeria, the local language is actually Hausa or Igbo. It's not predominantly, a lot of the content is not predominantly in English or in French or the languages that, machine learning or NLPs have been trained on globally. So when you try to use, algorithms like, Google Translate to try and understand what language or what piece of content says in Igbo, it fails terribly. It tells you something totally different. So how we've approached it as build-up is we try to figure out how can we build something that we call machine learning classifiers, where we get local teams within the country. So like in the context of Nigeria, we were working with Search for Common Ground, and we had a couple of influencers, but also local experts, civil society experts, who then were able to tell us, this is how we speak Igbo, and this is what is concerning from a religious perspective. So we collected some keywords in local language, and then we started using those keywords, to train an algorithm that then starts to understand how religion is being, religious conversations are being held on social media using local language. So it takes a longer time to do that, but at the end of the day, you achieve much better results than using, all the international algorithms to actually try and understand that particular conflict situation. Yeah.
One of the challenges that we find, other than turning on a microphone, is, I have a colleague in Palestine who said, I would never speak to a donor in Arabic because even if they understand Arabic, they're not going to, I'm not going to be able to convey the words they need to hear. So one of the things we're trying to do is turn that around, turn that racism around, that dominance of that colonial power, in effect, to center what you're saying is that they have to listen to the local actors or they're not going to get anywhere. And we've had the situation in Palestine. They said we've had 40 years of you doing service delivery in the way that you're doing it, and it's not getting the nuance of what's happening.
So we've talked a lot about how it seems like there's really different voices, different interests, and different agendas, essentially. And how do we shift that power right? So the next question then would be, how do we use data to mediate those different interests, agendas, and interests?
Our dilemma is really, in the first place, how do we make sure that the data we generate is used by the people who most need it? Okay? And that has been an impasse, really, because if you look at our monitoring, the data is downloaded regularly, monthly, by more than 600 risk consulting firms around the world. I was so shocked that there's so many risk consulting firms, right? And they get the data, the World Bank gets the data, Harvard gets the data, and of course they feed it into algorithms what to check about security for investments, etc. The problem is, when you look at the agencies who should be using it, some of them do, if it fits their agenda. So we've had very good relationship with the Human Rights Commission of the Bangsamoro and the Gender and Women's Bodies of the Bangsamoro. Not so much from the interior and local government, because they feel that the data shows out that violence is still rising. And the worst thing is that violence is coming from the MILF itself. So that's really the dilemma, no? And we're prepared for that situation. We have no choice, no? It's the truth. That's why I'm saying what autonomy. It is what is really happening. The nice thing about it was a lot of things changed, recently when we came out with a new report, because it came at a time when a lot of major flashpoints happened that validated the data. So that's it. So for us, it's a never-ending challenge, no? And the problem also, by the way, is a lot of people don't want to use the database because we've heard of donor agencies who are saying that they're going to use it to measure the accomplishments. So if you're a peace-building organization and you say in this village you're working there, I can give you the data in that village from 2020 to 2023. And if donors get hold of the data, they will say, hey, the number of fights are still increasing, the number of deaths are still increasing. No? So it's become where we're telling that we can explain it in some other way, no? And that's not the way to use it, right? But those are the problems, the realistic problems that they face. So if you find yourself that even your colleagues, are very careful about using your data because it might demonstrate good or bad results for the work that they're doing.
I think Nikki's point earlier, what was it, the comment, can an app stop the bullet? I would say process, and more process. That, interrogate the data. You have to bring communities together with donors and others to say, what is this really telling us? Which points are meaningful, which is not, what are we missing? And that, you said it takes longer, but we have to invest in designing those systems and processes that gives people an opportunity to make use of the data in a way that's meaningful for them, wherever they sit in the system, but that you also deliberatively agree which ones actually are telling you the story that you're seeing.
Maybe just maybe just to add just one more thing, I think the main issue about using data, especially in a response setting like mediation, is what level of trust do the parties involved have on this particular information you've collected, the data you've collected, and the insights that you're telling them. How did you arrive at those insights? That's usually a very critical component when it comes to trying to use data to justify certain actions or basically just conversing or mediating in one way or another. So I think the main thing that I always try to see in when you're talking about process actually is how collaborative is it when you're actually collecting the data, doing the analysis, and presenting the insights. How collaborative is that process with the local actors, with the people who are actually afflicted by conflict, as an example? And then from that, then you're able to gain that trust. And once you gain that trust, it will be now useful in the mediation process. So I do believe that trust, and especially building from collaboration, is very, very important when using data.
Thank you. I think it's also important, like what Elena said earlier, for us to be honest and recognize that these data sets and the analyses generated from them are by no means without fault, like you said also, Deborah. So securitization of data was something that was mentioned by Pancho, and it's not being talked about enough. And Alan has also mentioned, and Deborah pointed out several challenges. So let's talk about those challenges. Accountability, ethics are words that are coming up now in the debate on data, AI. So, please.
I can start. So yeah, when it comes to data analysis, there's quite a lot of challenges. Surprising, it's not surprising because you're dealing with a lot of information in one way or another. So I've seen recently there is this hype when it comes to using AI in solving global problems. Any proposal you see right now going to donors is we will integrate an AI system in solving this. It's not that easy at the end of the day because there's a lot of limitations when it comes to the AI system. So whenever I see integration of AI in a particular activity, I always need to interrogate the process and the methodology, and especially the limitations when it comes to, first of all, the data that is available to build that AI system, or at the end of the day, how do you translate the findings of the data collected into some of the useful insights that you come using an AI system in that process. So one of the main limitations I always get is that there is limited data to try and figure out how to integrate an AI model in learning a local context. For example, when it comes to language, one of the things that I always find as a challenge in my work is, as I mentioned, language. NLP processes or NLP systems available out here are trained on languages, and especially data from the global north. There is a lot of underrepresentation in terms of data that is trained from the global south. That then becomes a challenge because that particular process, if used in trying to solve local problems, becomes a huge challenge. And that is one of the key things. And then, of course, I think generally what we've discussed about localizing data, it's one of the major challenges that we always have. I don't think many people include their methodologies when it comes to the data collection, analysis, and reporting itself. So yeah, I would probably say that's kind of one of the key things that immediately comes to mind. Yeah.
We've had several of these kinds of experiences with language. No? One story is probably indicative of that. No? The entire notion of early warning. No? There are a lot of groups that talk about early warning systems that they develop. And we've always felt, that early warning systems are really very, what do you call this? Not only are they arrogant, the language is that we can actually predict violence. Yeah? And the problem we have is the moment you use that in the face of partners, you will be seen as someone supplying data to intelligence groups. Yeah? So if we shape ourselves as we are an early warning system, then The embassies will go to you, diplomatic posts, they will interview a reporter, journalists from other countries, etc. But that is not what we're after. We always tell them at the beginning, no? What we want to do is early response. The reason we get this data is that so people can respond towards trying to head off cases of violence. And it is less a tool to predict where violence is going to happen. Now that is very important for us because to be seen as an arm of intelligence agencies is really a problem. It's a problematic when it comes to your credibility. The data that we gather is used by different security groups, etc., for whatever purpose they might see it, because it does indicate places where you have hotspots. We can actually draw the hotspots, of data over periods of 1 year moving forward. But we've always refused to say that this is data as an early warning system for you guys not to. You better move out or you better prevent that, etc. It's not that. It's really to inform our partners so that they can do something. And that is the reason why Nikki spoke about a lot of work we're doing now is understanding the signals of polarization. When do you know what are the indicators that something is afoot when it comes to ISIS in Mindanao? What are the signs of polarization? And we've got a list of signs that we look for. But we use that then and feed the data to those that can make a difference. The Human Rights Commission, they enable them to prepare. Documentos, etc., indication of particular aspect where tension is sitting up, or to come up with systems where they can mediate clan conflicts before they explode, or they can put in blood money to be able to head off clan building. No? So that's and that all comes from understanding the language that you use and making sure that that language enables you to be seen as a party that is building peace rather than providing data for the military to chase insurgents, communists, to red tag people, which is a big problem here in the country.
One of the challenges most people, myself included, I kind of want to ask everyone here, are scared of this stuff. Like, I'm scared of AI. I mean, I'd love to see a show of hands. Are people scared of AI, right? Only a couple. You're all more comfortable with it than I am then. Oh, no, a few more. When you're talking the language of data and technology, it's very distant from people's day-to-day lives and experiences. So I'm not 100% sure that centering data in accountability systems is the right way to go. We just had a Trump election. Lord help us all. I'm Canadian, by the way. Just want to point that out. I was not responsible for Trump. We've had a Trump election, and people don't listen to the data. They don't listen to the facts. They don't listen to the information that's fed to them. It's about relationships, trust, and believing. So when we get into situations like in climate change, for example, there's a lot of work around deliberative systems and deliberative democracy. We've used it in other areas like reproductive rights. There was a referendum in Ireland. They bring together data points and help people make sense of that, but they don't really call it data. It's what are people saying, what are popular opinion, what are people's stories, how are they experiencing things. So I guess what I would urge is build a governance system that's transparent and accountable, but actually don't necessarily center the data and the technology, because I think people turn off. That's my own experience, but yeah.
Alan looks like he's ready to jump in.
Oh yeah, just actually wanted to build on something that they were said, and this is more or less around ethics that you mentioned, right? So when it comes to transparency, as you just said, one of the other limitations I always see when it comes to using data to 100% make a decision is that that data at the end of the day has a couple of things that are missing, right? Most of the time. Sensitive information, for example, you can't, at the moment, if you're looking at some initiatives, you can't use personal data and try, or you can't collect personal data without getting consent from the users, or you can't, collect information from social media as an example that contains personally identifiable information. So those missing links or data points sometimes miss the local, sometimes miss some insights or very important information that enables that data to stand on its own as an insight. And that is why you need to collaborate that data with, research that is done on the ground, with comments. For example, when I do a lot of social media analysis, I will say, I've seen this popular narrative that is on social media that is influencing a lot of decisions that are being made. But that in itself does not mean that we only use that as the truth. It needs to be collaborated with. Is there a local event that happened that led to people start discussing this topic online for it to be a popular narrative? So it's usually like a play between the data is here, it's contributing some insights, the local perspectives are here. It could be that you need to also collect data from surveys by listening to people's stories, actual stories on the ground, and then now using all that to try and make sense of the situation. So yeah, definitely. You wanted to add something?
What I do is I turn that into a story, right, that
Exactly.
people can relate to and understand and reflect that back to people. Does this reflect your experience? Because the numbers don't reflect people's lived experience.
I just was caught by the statement you made, your question about AI and who is using AI. I was informed when we started planning the WILTRIS, helping plan out the WILTRIS conference, that digitalization was a key word in the planning, and my initial reaction is, digitalization, what does it actually mean? So for me, the point was, how are we going to use new words like this, digitalization, AI, and make it accountable as well? So it's not really turning against it, but making sure that we are at the cusp of shaping it ourselves. Yeah. Remember, guys, that we came through a revolution in information, right? And we, especially in the development sector, we've been able to liberate ourselves by looking at process, participation, whose reality counts, no, change, etc. And I feel that we're losing the data again. We went through a process where it's been actually more and more used by local people. What language like digitalization or AI, etc. It's like it's scary because it returns again. It turns the data gathering process into an expert's domain. It's like, and that's what worries me. But my reaction is not to say no to AI or no to digitalization. It's how do we make sure that as we evolve the systems, that we make sure that they are equally accountable to the publics that we work with, rather than talking organizations.
I just have one question, actually two questions for Pancho, which I feel might really help in terms of contextualizing some information. So I think earlier you mentioned about data that is available to risk agencies, and they use that to make sense of situations. Is there any worry that you normally have when putting out this data in terms of being used by intelligence agencies as a first? And then number two is, when it comes to sensitive information, how do you treat that? So because I think, yeah.
First of all, we have a developed system for what we define as sensitive, okay? And it's not open provided, okay? So we don't even make that available. So when we talk about names, for example, or localities, etc. So we have a CSV system in place, and then you can download the data. What that data is, what do you call this, on the back end, okay? So that's the first. Second, sure, of course, we're always concerned about how our data can be used. Okay, and certainly the reason it's being downloaded is because it's a source information to justify advice given by all these risk firms to their clients, right? Do not go to the Philippines because it's a hot spot now, etc. According to this report that we got, etc. So we cannot prevent that from happening. From the start. We always ask this question: are our hearts in the right place? The main point is to make sure that the data that we have is equally available to those who are most vulnerable. And that is where we put our attention. And that is why I raised the worry. What if the same clients you had before, who needed the data, suddenly think that your data is dangerous for their own interest now? Because they are now in power. They are now in power. And you know this line by Sidney Jones, no? Fantastic line. He made a comment on the study we made. We just released, and he said, you know, Pancho, for me, what was very clear was that most of the violence was happening in Maguindanao. Maguindanao is the heartland of the War Islamic Liberation Front, and the War Islamic Liberation Front are the chief perpetrators. Oh, this came from Sydney, who's a writer now, she's retired now. But to come from her, you know, really, that's the problem we face. Our colleagues before suddenly see us as a source of information that denigrates the efforts they have made. And that's where we come back to honesty. Honesty. We have to be honest, we have to be autonomous, and our data needs to be interoperable. They need to be able, it needs to be able to talk to other databases. So a lot of effort has been placed on how do you use the data to be interoperable with humanitarian data, with resource data, climate change data.
I feel like we can go on for the rest of the day, but Ahmed is waving the 10-minute sign. So just as a final question, maybe Pancho mentioned earlier that it's a there are never-ending challenges, but then how do we now weave in other important issues like climate change, like you mentioned, its various impacts and how it interacts with other issues like violent conflict?
Um, I go back to the idea around, I mean, what's happening on the horizon out there in other sectors is there's a lot of thinking about shifting power. There's a lot of thinking about more inclusive deliberative processes around these things. And there's a lot of thinking around intersectionality. So that link between climate, humanitarian conflict, you know, these things are widely interconnected. So what are the common shared data points, I think is really important. But again, the common processes so that you're not necessarily working in silos. So there's more effort being placed on trying to bring communities in. You know, I worked a lot with the Shift the Power movement, where we come together, whatever issue you're working on, environment, development, humanitarian, peace building, and see what are our common points of interest that we can share platforms, that we can share information, that we can share power to demand what it is we want and need internationally. And that's really becoming much more prominent. Sometimes I use the word shift the power, locally led development, decolonization, which is more threatening to decision makers. So that's what I say is try and get into those spaces where we're looking at these common issues. And then politically, I'm a real fan of deliberative democracy, and I think that has a lot to offer climate, conflict, humanitarian spaces.
Yeah, so I don't think I have much to say on that, but one thing that I can add is, and maybe just also reference what Pancho said in terms of interoperability of data, is because some of the information that you collect, some of this analysis that you do, it's not only targeted at one situation. It could be actually targeted at multiple situations. So the same data set can actually be used to understand conflict. Same thing can be used in climate or environmental issues. It can be used in, quite a number of, of issues that you're tracking. So one thing that I always also try to figure out is there is a lot of research that is done, a lot of data collection that is done by so many agencies, so many institutions, but most of the time it's not talking to each other. And that becomes a very huge limitation in one way or another. I've done some projects when it comes to like how, the data that relates to conflict can also talk to data that relates to, for example, climate. I've done some research on how conversations online are related to, the COP conferences. So whenever we have the COP conferences, there are issues being discussed by different countries around climate change, right? And one of the things we actually realized is that the big oil companies are paying a lot of, what do we call them? Advertising agencies or like, to try and influence public opinion in relation to these specific issues being discussed at COP. And that then fuels a lot of violence, starting from the digital space, which then disseminates to local areas where people now are like, we are not represented in these conversations, or some people feel like, these countries are not even doing anything about climate change. So there is that, connection between what happens, for example, on digital spaces when it comes to, the climate issues, conversations that are happening publicly, like at COP, what happens locally in different countries. And you can see that that needs to talk to each other. You can't just say, I am doing this research or I am collecting this data to only solve this one problem. It needs to be something that, is collaborative, then talks to each other in one way or another.
Okay. I'd like to invite everyone to please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause.